Welcome to a special interview segment on the Nights On, Lights Off podcast. This is Will from Game Escape, and I'm actually doing something different. I'm recording here in the daylight, but it's nighttime. We're just about nighttime in Tokyo, and I'm joined by a guest that I've wanted to talk to for a long time. His name is Oscar, and he is an American game developer working in Tokyo. Oscar, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on. It's very interesting to be on a podcast. I've actually never been on one before. I have been interviewed a couple times, but it's been a while for that too. So I'm very happy to be here and hope it's an interesting conversation. I literally do not know what we're talking about besides me a little bit.
Well, you were one of the earliest people on our Discord, earliest members to join the Discord, and I feel like we've kind of followed your trajectory. I remember talking to you as you were kind of getting your career going, and it's been a couple years now, and I figured what a perfect guest to have on a show that's talking about Japanese gaming, import gaming, retro gaming, things like that. So, do you want to tell the audience a little bit about you, what you do in the industry, where you work?
Sure, yeah. So I currently work at a game company in Tokyo called Grezzo. I've only been there for about a year now, fairly recent. I started in like December last year. And Grezzo is not particularly well known. I feel like it's getting a little bit more known lately, but very interesting company. It's very close relationship with Nintendo. So a lot of the games that we've worked on have been a lot of the Zelda remake games, including like Ocarina of Time 3D and Majora's Mask 3D, and more recently the Link's Awakening remake on Switch, and even more recently the Legend of Zelda: Echoes of Wisdom, which we just released. Um, and yeah, so I joined them fairly recently. And before that, I was working at a kind of no name contract developer in Kyoto, which unfortunately didn't work out super well in the end, but was an interesting experience overall and did bring me to Japan. And before that, I was a indie game developer mostly. So I worked on a game called Super Slime Arena, which is like a little kind of like party fighting game that I developed with a couple of my university friends. And it actually started off as a class project, but we sort of kept working on it over time. And eventually it kind of got to the point where we thought we should try to release it. And we did. And doing all that also brought us to a bunch of different game conventions, including one in Kyoto called Bit Summit, which I first went to in 2018 to exhibit. And that's kind of what kind of got me really properly on the hey, Japan is a real place and maybe I should try to live here train. And a couple years after that, it actually worked out and I moved over. So yeah, it's been an interesting journey for me for sure. And I still kind of feel like at my current position, because I'm still pretty new, that I'm still, you know, kind of trying to see if I'll even be at the company long term or not. But it's definitely it's a very interesting challenge and very like inspiring place to be, I'll say too. Yeah, I think I've talked a little bit. Yeah, if you have any comments on that, go ahead.
No, I mean, I definitely wanna get into transitioning over
Mm,
there, working, getting into the industry over there, but I since you mentioned it, Zelda: Echoes of Wisdom, I mean, are you able to tell us, if you worked on that, and if so, what you did with that game?
yeah, I actually so I joined quite late in the development of that game, so I actually was not working on it, and it was kind of interesting because I was aware of it when I was there, but I didn't actually sign like an NDA or was ever like debriefed about what was going on. I just kind of occasionally would hear people talking about things, and sometimes I saw little bits and pieces of it. So I was kind of, obviously, even though I didn't sign an NDA, it wasn't like I could just tell people about, oh yeah, I saw this and I don't know what this is, and it seems interesting. I suppose it's not that surprising that Grezzo is making another Zelda game, but it was very interesting, sort of figuring out exactly what they were doing. And then obviously once I saw like the release, like the preview videos and stuff, it was very exciting. And yeah, I don't know, it's been cool, and I've been playing it recently too. We actually everyone at the company got a free copy of the game, so I've been playing it quite a bit and enjoying it quite a bit. I don't Yeah, it's been
Yeah,
very interesting.
I've been playing it as well, and I'm really impressed with it.
Mhm.
It's interesting. Um, I am not, and this is probably gonna get a lot of people angry. I'm not a fan of the new Zelda, like Breath of the Wild and Tears
Mm,
of the Kingdom type games. I feel like I've always just liked the overhead Zelda games
mm,
from my youth. And when I played this one, at first I was kind of put off, like, oh, they're bringing in some of those Tears of the Kingdom, Breath of the Wild mechanics. But
mhm.
as you play the game longer, I feel like it really works from an overhead perspective. And I think it gets you to kind of focus on the great art. You're not just, it's not just an action game. You're really thinking about how do you manipulate the environment. So I've
Yeah,
been having a blast with it.
yeah, I definitely I think the art direction works really, really well, and I've been actually very impressed with the sound as well. I feel like the music and sound design is really great. That's another thing. I kind of am of a similar opinion with Tears of the Kingdom, Breath of the Wild as well. And I think having a game where we actually have like proper dungeons again, and I guess it's not totally linear, but fairly linear story seems like, and it's more of what I'm used to. And yeah, I'm actually kind of interested to hear your opinions on it. Did you play the Link's Awakening remake? Because I remember one of your older videos talking about how that's a really, maybe I don't know if it's your favorite Zelda game, but it's definitely one that's very close to your heart. So I was kind of curious if you had any experiences with the remake and maybe how this current game maybe feels similar because the art style and a lot of other things are sort of carried over from the remake into this one. So, want to hear your
Well,
thoughts
yeah,
on that.
that the Link's Awakening on the Game Boy really is my favorite, and it was probably one of my, if I had to pick a top 5 game,
Mm,
that would be up there. I did play the Switch re-release. I was very excited. It was really one of the games I was looking forward to. I think it came out in 2019,
that's
and
right.
I have to say I was a little disappointed by it because of the frame rate issues.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like the engine in that game, and I would imagine the same engine in this game, it just as you transition from screen to screen or when there's a lot of objects and animations on the screen, it really does chug. Like you could feel it drop. I'm guessing it targets 60, but then it kind of drops down to 30 or below pretty frequently. So I felt like that threw me off enough where I didn't actually finish it.
Mm-hmm.
But this one, again, it has the same problems, but I feel like since it's not necessarily a pure action game, or at least not a pure action game in the way that Link's Awakening was, the frame rate doesn't bother you so much because you're kind of like focused on the screen and on the puzzle in front of you, and you're
Mm-hmm.
doing more with the environment. So there's not as many transitions. And then when you're in the actual dungeons, the frame rate improves.
Yeah, I've definitely
So
noticed that too. Mm.
yeah, so I would say, um, although playing this, I do kind of want to go back to the Link's Awakening re-release just because I probably should finish it because there's a lot to like. You can tell that there is such a respect for the material, and I don't want to sound tacky, but there's like a love for that source material in both of these games.
Yeah, I've definitely noticed that too. I think I don't know exactly how like my boss and people in my company like originally convinced Nintendo to let them make the Ocarina of Time 3D because that was like one of the first games this company ever made. Which, to be fair, a lot of the founders of Grezzo are like ex Square Enix people. So, like, my big boss is Koichi Ishii, who's the guy who created the Seiken Densetsu slash Mana series, and is one of the original like Final Fantasy guys. So, like, he created Chocobos and Moogles among other things. So he's a very like up there guy. So I can understand why they maybe would give him a chance. But I think one thing I've heard a lot about the Ocarina of Time remake that people talk about fairly regularly is that they originally they were fixing a lot of the bugs that were in the original game, but because partially at least because a lot of the like speed running community and also just people that remember those games very well like were kind of more kind of nostalgic about the bugs and they thought that like leaving them in or sometimes even recreating them in ways that didn't interfere with the main experience sort of made it better for players. So I feel like there's kind of a crazy attention to detail, at least in some respects, for how Grezzo approaches mostly remakes and kind of just like game design in general. So I'm hoping that maybe if I work there long enough, I can sort of observe that and take some of that to heart and understand how and why they do a lot of that.
Yeah, it's funny when you play a game these days that has that love and attention to detail, it really stands out because, on this show, we've talked about kind of being a little bit jaded with the modern AAA gaming product and some of the
Mhm.
practices, at least in the Western, gaming market. But, when people again, when they're invested in the way it seems like your company is invested in these games, it's just really a breath of fresh air.
Hmm.
So, I have uh, Ocarina of Time, remake in the closet. I have not played it because again, I'm a top-down Zelda guy, but now I feel like I wanna
Yeah,
go
yeah.
back and see what it's all about.
I do like honestly like I like both styles of Zelda. I think I am a little bit more on like the top down side. I also really like Zelda 2, like the Adventure of Link, even though it's a side scroller. Um, but I definitely really recommend the Ocarina of Time 3D. I think it really it sort of highlights the best parts of that game while enhancing it. Obviously, it looks very nice. I think the UI is also really good. And also, yeah, about me a little bit more. Like, I'm mostly a designer. Currently, I work at Grezzo as a mostly UI UX designer, although I do a little bit of like scripting and implementation and stuff as well. Um, but yeah, I think for me, one of the other reasons why I was interested in Grezzo was because I think they did a really good job with streamlining the a user interface for Ocarina of Time 3D, and I was impressed by that. So I definitely, if you want to play Ocarina of Time, it's definitely I think the best way to do it. Outside of maybe some of the like fan made remake things, but yeah, Ocarina of Time 3D is very solid. So I highly recommend it.
Yeah, I think, that'll go on my list. I've gotta finish the new one, I'm gonna finish the Echoes game, and I also
Mhm.
have to finish Astrobot, which has been the other game that I've really enjoyed here early on in the fall, but, the backlog is immense.
Yeah,
We
indeed.
me and Jay, he calls himself the Tsumige importer, and he
Mhm.
explained to me what that meant, kind of like hoarding and stacking games.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, so, I'm in the same category there, but it's interesting. So you're a, UI designer,
Mhm.
um, and, it's funny 'cause I've always had a question of people who work in the industry. I don't know if this necessarily would apply to you or if it's just extremely naive, but I've always
Mhm.
wondered, how does a game get from a concept to a finished product? Like, do you begin with a game engine and a set of core technologies, and then you kinda think about, "Well, what could I create with this engine?" Or is it really like, I have a concept, I do some concept art, I have some, UI ideas, and then you build the tech around that vision?
I would say probably this applies not just to this in general, but overall in game development. I think there's just a lot of different patterns. So for Grezzo's case, I actually haven't seen anything like go from start to finish. I basically only have seen like the end of stuff so far. So I'm not quite sure how like the initial concept things start there. Previous companies I've worked at, and also when I was an indie game developer, uh, the main like big game I worked on and released for indie games was that Super Slime Arena game I mentioned earlier, and that basically started off as a class project actually, and it was literally just to make a accessible fighting game. Um,
Okay.
so we literally had an assignment to design a game based around that, and then we made the demo, and then as we kept adding on to that, it sort of got big enough to be like an actual releasable product. But yeah, in that case, I guess we had what we wanted to accomplish. We had whatever resources we could find in terms of game engines, and we ended up making it in a relatively obscure one, which was kind of good and bad. But it's a engine called Hax Flixel. So Flixel is a action script library, which is basically like the programming language that was used to make Flash games. So it has a lot of like Flash-like things built into it in terms of like animations and tweening, and this Flixel in particular is sort of geared towards making 2D pixel art games. So it's also all free and open source, which is cool. So we thought it was an interesting project, and we wanted to make like a side-scrolling 2D fighting game, kind of like Smash Brothers, basically. Uh, I guess yeah, Smash Brothers, but 2D. uh, but yeah, that's why we ended up choosing that engine. Um, so I think it depends a lot, and I will say at Grezzo, like it seems like we're not like actually like a Nintendo company. We do contract developer for other companies, and we make our own stuff as well. Um, it kind of seems to depend on what makes sense for the project and what our expertise is. I mean, for example, the project I'm currently working on, which is called Jet Dragon, and has already been released. It's a Apple Arcade game, so it's on like iOS and Mac devices. Kind of get the feeling that Apple Arcade is not super popular, so I don't know if many people have actually played it, but it's a pretty interesting kind of like racing dragon, like breeding simulation and like team management game. So basically, you have like a team of riders that ride racing dragons, and you also are raising the dragons yourself. And there's a little bit of a story too. The gameplay, I would say, is like relatively simple on like the action part of it, where you're racing, but relatively complex on the like management part of it, because you also have sort of this giant floating fortress called a tower ship that you can like build buildings on and upgrade and manage your teams and stuff. It's not crazy expansive, but anyway, that game was the first game that Grezzo made in Unity, which is one of the major game engines out there, and relatively recently has been somewhat controversial too, because they uh, were planning to start charging developers a like per install fee. So anytime someone installed a game you made, you would have to pay Unity a certain amount of money, which
I
was
remember that
yeah,
controversy, yeah.
which was extremely unpopular with game developers. And actually, very recently, I think maybe like last week or maybe 2 weeks ago, they apparently have walked that back now. So kind of lost a lot of goodwill and like developer interest for nothing, it seems like. But
Yeah,
Grezzo started that game, yeah, way before the controversy. Sorry, go ahead.
no, I was gonna say that, you talked about Apple Arcade, and yeah, I don't think it's, that popular in America, but I did notice when I was, in Japan, like, a lot of mobile gaming going on in the subways, so, you know, I could see is that the case, or was that just what I kinda noticed on my
Yeah.
particular route?
I don't know about Apple Arcade in particular, but definitely mobile games, particularly like people that are on commutes, are very, very popular in Japan. When I'm taking the train, which I ride like the Yamanote line every day, which is kind of the most main sort of like loop line that goes around Tokyo.
Yeah, I spent a
Uh,
lot of time on that.
yeah, me too. Yeah, I'd say like a good, probably at least like 30% of people are playing some sort of mobile game, and I know that Jet Dragon is more popular in Japan than it is in America. I don't know what the exact numbers are, but yeah, I think also even compared to America, I know iPhones are like definitely the most prominent like phone operating system in Japan. So probably works out that that game is slightly more popular because of that as well. But yeah, definitely. I see people every once in a while. I'll see someone pull out like a DS or a PSP or
Huh.
something even older. Sometimes, whenever I see that, I get really happy because I actually still play my DS Lite fairly often on the train. Um, Sometimes GBA. Although lately, because I've been playing Zelda, I've been bringing my Switch, which is still a little bit too big for me. I think I might want to get a Switch Lite just because it is smaller and a little bit more easy to deal with on the train.
Yeah, and then, of course, when you're on these trains, at least maybe I found this, it's hard to get a seat, they're so jammed, like, how do you game effectively? So I think the phone kinda lends itself more than, pulling out a big Switch, or imagine, like, the Steam Deck or something like that,
Oh
that I don't think
yeah,
that would work.
yeah, yeah.
But,
Sometimes I get lucky and I can get a seat, but yeah, my commute uses multiple trains, and the other train that's not the Yamanote line is a bit less crowded most of the time. So usually, at least for about like half of my commute, I can sit down. So that's kind of nice.
no, I was mostly standing, and I'm a, kind of, pretty tall guy, so I was able to survey what everyone was doing. and
Nice.
I that's when I noticed, a lot of the gaming, and I could see how this, Jet Dragon game would be popular because it sounds to me like it's kind of a mixture of Winning Post and Pokemon, something like that. Would that be a fair description?
Yeah, a little bit. So there are different varieties of dragons you can uh, find and breed. It definitely takes a lot of influence from those like Japanese horse racing simulation games. I think my big boss worked on, what was it? Not Chocobo Racing, but like Chocobo. It's just called Chocobo Stallion. There's like that Chocobo like racing game where you also sort of like breed them. I believe it is
Yeah.
sort of take influence from that.
I don't know, that's one genre I have not gotten into, is the Japanese horse racing simulators, and I feel
Yeah.
like I've gone so far down the rabbit hole on a lot of these games, whether it's mahjong or now, like, the train simulators.
Oh yeah.
Um, Shai, introduced me to a series called Furaiki. It's kind of like, the motorcycle tourism game,
Mm,
so there are all these different genres, but the horse racing, that is I mean, there is obviously horse racing in the States, but it has declined so much in popularity that it just seems such a foreign concept to me.
yeah, I see. Yeah, it's
But,
definitely interesting in Japan how popular it is. I think part of it is because like Uma Musume is still very very popular here, like
mm.
both the anime and the game and whatever else is around it for it. There's probably other things I don't know about Uma Musume, but it's funny. Like you go to the game centers and you'll see like stuffed plush versions of like actual race horses. People are like trying to get into UFO catchers. So it's still like just regular horse racing is still really really big here, and it's interesting how these like salaryman hobbies from a long time ago are still very relevant here and becoming even more popular now because of the sort of crossover stuff like Uma Musume, which I think in particular is just kind of an amazing like combination of all these different like interests that people have in Japan, particularly like the stereotypical salaryman because it has like horses obviously and horse racing and I guess to a certain extent betting. It has like their cute girls, which people like cute girls in general, but yeah. And they're also like idols. So like after they do their race, they do like an idol like music performance thing.
So,
So I feel really sorry for these girls. They have to like run all day and then perform after their race. And Jesus, this sounds so tiring. But I guess if they're like horse girls, they, they have lots of energy. But it really is, yeah, this bizarre combination of salaryman interests.
cool. Yeah, that's well, there's so much, to discover in the Japanese culture that you don't necessarily realize until you either go down the rabbit hole or go over there, but, I wanted to circle back to you,
Mhm.
making the transition and working over there. So you said you released this game, you went to a trade show, convention, and that's kind of how you made contact with at least the idea of going over there. But how specifically did you make the transition? When did you know, hey, I want to be a developer over there versus in the States?
I guess one part of it is that the games industry in the states, while obviously you can get paid a lot more than you can be in Japan, is very very volatile. Like I know a lot of people that still work in it over there, but many of my friends, even at like very large companies that have been there for a while, have been laid off at least once or twice, and particularly recently, like in the last 3 or 4 years, it's just like there's absolutely no like job stability in it. Um, and I think particularly if you have to move to some really high cost of living area like San Francisco or Los Angeles or Washington or whatever, like Seattle area, um, it can be. I think for me, it just seems kind of scary because it's like you don't, for one, you don't get paid that much. I mean, compared to Japan, you get paid more, obviously, but you know, if you're in a situation where you're on like a year contract or you've been there for a while and then suddenly you get laid off, I feel like you can very easily just get completely screwed in the states, particularly yeah if you're living really far away from your family and living in a very expensive apartment. And I kind of just didn't want to deal with that. So for a while I tried being an indie developer, and I wasn't mega successful at it, but I think coming over to that convention in Kyoto and also just taking some time to be around Japan and I guess noticing it was relatively low cost of living, which was nice. um, and meeting some other developers that had made the transition while I was over there kind of inspired me. I wasn't dead set on it from the start, to be honest. Like I thought it would be really nice, but I also think, well, it'd be pretty hard. I did at that when I first went to Japan. I basically spoke no Japanese as well, so it was very limiting in that way. Um, but yeah, eventually I got to the point where the development on the Super Slime Arena game had basically been finished. There's a couple other things that happened in the middle of that, but I don't really need to get into it here. But um, basically got to the point where I was looking for a new job, and I wasn't, as I said, I wasn't like dead set on it, but I did apply to some places in Japan and didn't get that much success, to be honest, but eventually did um, find a company in Kyoto that I worked for before I worked at my current company. And obviously the pandemic also happened in the middle of all that. So I did spend about a year waiting to actually come over. Um, which was pretty tough. But I was able to do some contract work in the middle of that, so it wasn't like I was starving or anything. But it was mostly just waiting for the borders to open again.
Interesting,
Um,
yeah. I was
yeah.
wondering how did the so, like, what does the job hunt look like as somebody who, is based in the States, but applying over there?
Mm,
And obviously you had the language barrier, so, like, what was that process for you?
yeah. So originally I was looking mostly online. Like I did meet some people while I was there, and I had a couple interviews with places that they were mostly foreign staff there, so they didn't really need the Japanese language at the from the start. Um, so I almost got a job working for a company that is kind of involved with like the RPG Maker series because they were making basically a new game engine, and they wanted to hire a pixel artist, which I did a lot of pixel art for my indie development stuff, basically to make asset packs and also help on some like basically example games that they're making with the engine. And actually, I had a friend from my same university who ended up coming over to work as a programmer in that same company. Um, but I think they ran out of funding, or they something happened with like the money part of it in terms of that position that I was going to have uh, sort of evaporating. So I ended up not being able to do that. Um, so after that, I was looking around for a while. I applied to some places online, but there's honestly not that many places that are willing to just take kind of even people that have some experience, but not like a huge amount of experience that don't speak Japanese. So the first job I ended up getting in Japan was largely because of a friend that I met in Boston. I went to university in Boston, and they were half Japanese, and they were living in Japan for a while, studying Japanese at Kyoto University, and also working at the company that I ended up working for, which is like a small, mostly like contract developer. They mostly don't do games, honestly. They do some games, but um, they said they were interested in making more game stuff, which is why they hired me. And they were basically, I think they have like one Japanese staff, but everyone else is various types of foreigners, mostly Europeans, but there's also a handful of people from kind of just all over the place. Um, so in that case, yeah, I kind of found a little niche where I could get in, where it was like a foreign company where you didn't have to speak Japanese. They wanted to make games, but they were a really small company, so they kind of wanted somebody with like indie game development experience because it was basically similar, like team size. Um, don't need to get in too much because it kind of didn't work out in the end. I got laid off in a pretty nasty way, and there was a bunch of uh, bad things that happened at the end of that. But that's basically how I got over here. And
Interest
yeah, I'll say another thing is like if people that are interested that are coming over to Japan, the main way that Japanese companies in general and also Japanese game companies hire people is usually called like new graduate hires. Um, so even if you're graduating from like a trade school type thing, when they do have a lot of them here, they're specifically for sort of like media and game development and things. Once you graduate, they have a very formalized system of where, like, okay, this is like this time you are going to go out and do a bunch of interviews, and you're going to try to get a job before this deadline, and a whole bunch of people get hired at once, kind of deal. So since I've been at Grezzo, I've actually seen that process happen once, where we got a whole bunch of the new graduate hires come in. Um, so even obviously most places still need you to speak Japanese, But even if you're foreign, if you come over here and do a sort of trade school type thing, which some of the programs I think are only like maybe 6 months or a year long or something. Um, that gives you an opportunity to join a company as a new graduate hire. And I think sometimes you can even do that if you're here for like language school. So if you already have a lot of skills and you want to just come over here and study Japanese and then graduate from that and then get a job, that's also a way. Um, in my case, like my current job for Grezzo, um, I had been in contact with like an art director there for quite a while on social media, actually. And I just been talking to him and sort of sharing some of the artwork I've been working on and getting feedback and stuff. And eventually I told him about what was happening with my last job and how it was kind of not going well and I needed to get something new. And he didn't like hire me on the spot or anything, but I think he put in a good word for me. And then it's kind of funny because I did um, couple like casual interviews at Grosso before I did like a proper interview. So the first one was literally just meeting the art director guy that I knew online for a while at an izakaya, and we
Huh.
kind of just talked about, um, yeah, like what was going on with Grezzo, what he wanted to know more about my experience, and uh, it was very like, yeah, I'd say just like a casual interview, like mostly talking about work stuff, but a little bit about me personally, and why I was interested in Grezzo and how I even knew about Grezzo and whatnot. And then after that, I actually met a bunch of the like higher up staff along with another guy who was interested in the company who was foreign, and I was with like a French guy. He's like a mostly like a concept artist, kind of storyboarder type guy. He worked a lot in animation before, so he was interesting fellow. But yeah, basically me and him, and then the art director guy that I know, and then actually the big boss of Grezzo. We had dinner and we talked a bunch about like what like Grezzo wants to do in the future and how we might fit into that. And the French fellow didn't really speak very much Japanese, so I was also kind of like trying to be sort of like translator mode, although I'm not particularly good at that to be honest. Um, but yeah, that happened, and then after that, it seemed like things were going really well. So I was like, oh man, this is great. Like they're just gonna give me an offer. This is awesome. And then I waited for about a week and I didn't hear anything back. And then I got in contact with the art director guy again, and I said, "Oh yeah, like I had a really good time. I'm very interested in Grezzo. Um, like what's happening next? Because it seemed really positive. Like oh yeah, things are gonna be great, and I'm gonna get an offer because I needed an offer pretty quickly to keep my visa actually. So it was a little bit scary. Um, but eventually it turns out it's like oh yeah, you just have to like apply normally now. It's like all that stuff was just kind of it was nice, and I'm sure it helped, but I just had to send in send them like the HR staff like my resume, and then I did two more like actual interviews with other staff, uh, mostly like the head UI guy, and then sort of like the general manager of the company. So my big boss is still Ishii-san, but he doesn't run like the day-to-day stuff of the company. So basically, like the general manager and one of the other like lead art people was my last interview, and it was actually fairly difficult. Like they, went through my whole portfolio that I sent them and asked a bunch of questions about how I did stuff and why I did stuff and how big the team sizes were and stuff like that. And eventually, did get an offer, so it did work out. But it was a pretty long process. I think at least like 2 months or so of doing the interviews and waiting and coming back for another interview and submitting a bunch of documents. But yeah, that's kind of how I ended up at Grezzo. Sorry if that was a very long,
No,
somewhat rambling monologue.
I mean, I think it's actually fascinating to see, how that kind of process works because I mean, interviews are, I think, to a degree culturally specific, that
Mhm.
each kind of company in different countries is going to have their own process, but I think for someone who's looking to get into the industry over there, it's good to hear that. I mean, do you think
Mhm.
that the informal dinner izakaya type contact, is that typical where you kinda network, you get to know the people informally, and then you go through this formalized process? Or was that just kinda specific to your experience in Grezzo?
Say this probably somewhat rare, but not unheard of. I think if you're what they call like a mid-career hire here, so someone who already has experience, you're not like a new graduate. That's probably fairly common, but not crazy common. Like I think a lot of people just they just apply directly and then they go. You are able to meet someone, and I've been talking with the art director guy for like well over a year before I was like, oh, I'm going to apply to Grezzo. I need to apply to somewhere. Um, so I wasn't even doing that specifically with the intention of like, oh, I'm going to apply because I honestly I thought that my skills and my Japanese weren't good enough up until then. But I was, talking with him and showing him what I was working on and trying to improve. So I'm sure that helped. Finding someone who has enough time and interest to actually sort of listen and look at your stuff, I think, can be difficult in general. Um, but I think in Grezzo's case, and particularly that art director's case, I think they were also kind of interested in hiring like more global people, for lack of a better word, hiring foreigners to some extent. Because Grezzo is about 100 staff right now, and we have, I think, two people from Taiwan, one guy from Korea, and then me, and everyone else is Japanese. So I think I don't know specifically why, but I think that the art director is kind of interested in maybe just getting more, uh, I guess, diverse opinions and experiences to sort of contribute to with stuff we do there. And probably having at least one English speaker can be useful in some cases too. So that might have also helped me a little bit in this case because they do not have any like English speakers. Um, so yeah, it probably depends a lot on the situation. I think a lot of the larger game companies in Japan have a lot more foreign staff now. Like my friend I mentioned before who worked at the company making like the game engine, he actually currently works at Sega. He's been there for I think maybe like 2 years now or so. He's having a great time at Sega, and obviously Sega still mostly does everything in Japanese as well, but they have a lot more foreign staff. So a lot of those companies, I think, if you have enough skill, they will even accommodate English speakers that don't know very much Japanese at all. I think like Bandai Namco specifically mentions they have sort of like a translation team, like in-house, I guess, bridge team that sort of helps with anybody that doesn't know Japanese yet. But usually they also will encourage you and maybe even like force you to get Japanese lessons eventually. So
Well, yeah, so
obviously,
let's
yeah.
talk about the language barrier. I mean, so how did you become proficient enough to, function in the workplace after you got there?
Yeah, so after that first trip to Japan, I did start taking lessons in America. Not very intense lessons, so they were like once a week for like I think an hour or maybe an hour and a half. I used to live in like the Washington D.C. area. There's like a Japan America Society of Washington D.C. that gave like these lessons, and they were quite affordable, and they were just like group lessons and very basic. I think I got like they have obviously katakana, hiragana, and a lot of really basic grammar from that. Um, I would say that probably I didn't really start learning like properly until I moved to Japan. Um, and because it was the pandemic, I think I was a little bit in a bit of like an English bubble for quite a while because yeah, you couldn't really go out and do as much things as you would normally, and it was kind of I guess dangerous to do so even. Um, but eventually, I did also get a Japanese girlfriend, and she didn't really speak English, so that was probably the main reason why I was sort of put into situations where I had to use the Japanese I knew already and work very hard to get better at it quickly. Um, so that helped a lot. I would say definitely don't just date somebody because you want to learn their language, but it did end up kind of working out for me in that way as well. And I think largely because of her, I was able to get pretty good at speaking Japanese. I still had a lot to learn in terms of reading, which I'm getting a lot better at recently because all my work communications are in Japanese and I have to read a lot. Um, but yeah, that's basically my experience, and I'm still taking lessons as well. I still take like weekly lessons with a one-on-one teacher. So I'm trying to pass the N2, which is the second highest level of like the official Japanese proficiency test. Hopefully, can
Yeah.
pass. I think I might be a little bit like giddy giddy, as they say, like not quite there, but maybe there. Like I'm not sure, but um, I am able to mostly communicate without many problems in daily life and at work as well. So think obviously coming over here and having some reason that you need to slash want to use it a lot will help a lot. And I'm actually playing the Echoes of Wisdom in Japanese too, and surprisingly not really having any issues with that, even though my kanji isn't amazing. But it's a fairly simple game too, story wise, so that probably explains a bit of that.
Yeah, I mean, I would second that. When I've been dating someone and speaking their language is just a great way to learn. As somebody who, I kind of studied and lived in Europe and found that
Mm,
to be very true.
mm,
Um, and again, having that reason, I think, is critical. But I also would say, like, it's so easy to find through the internet just material, like you said, you're playing a game in Japanese. You
mm,
know, that can help too. But, it's funny. I was wondering, so you had the language barrier, you're taking the classes and you're kind of, you've learned how to kind of overcome that, but is there any, like, what I would call workplace culture shock, where you're like, "Man, they just do things so differently over there."
mm.
Is there anything like that, or just, pretty standard kinda game development atmosphere?
Say it's fairly standard. I guess also from my experience, I haven't worked at like a large or even like large-ish game company in America, so I'm not quite sure how different it is. Um, but I haven't had any like really like huge crazy culture shock moments in general, not just at work, like just in general. Although I think part of that is because I do enjoy and have experienced a lot of Japanese media of various sorts, so
Hmm.
I already kind of know a lot about how stuff works here. I guess like learning the sort of formal structure they do in business meetings can be kind of interesting. Although Grezzo is not particularly like crazy formal. Like we don't always use Kego, for example, which is sort of a very like formal type of speaking. Use it a little bit, but generally speaking, yeah, it's kind of just a standard polite but not crazy polite version of Japanese we use. I guess like one thing I got used to is that you have to write a daily report every day in Japanese, and it has a very specific structure that you like email to your managers. So there's a lot of things in general about email that are extremely formulaic, and there's kind of good and bad things about it. I'd say the good things about it are that because it's so standardized, like you can just look up like if I'm writing this type of email, like what do I use, what word do I use here, and like what structure do I use here. There are many websites on the Japanese internet that just explain what to do in every situation. So you kind of can just look up what you're supposed to do, which is quite nice. The bad part is that it's often like like emails are generally like business emails are very formal Japanese, and probably they gave me a little bit of slack because I'm a foreigner. But I think if you're Japanese, you probably have to be really careful about like what words you use, and um, in general, there's a lot of stuff in the Japanese language about like knowing who is sort of the person above you in hierarchy or age or otherwise, and using the right words to talk about like what they do versus what you're telling them, and it can get kind of confusing. And they're just long emails too. But because a lot of them are very formulaic, you can like copy paste a lot of the basic parts and just fill in the things you need to actually talk about. So it's kind of a mix of that. So I guess like that's one thing. Like I think also just using a lot of email versus we do use a thing that's kind of like Slack at Grezzo too. So a lot of our communications is um, maybe pretty similar to what you would do in the West with like a Slack or whatever, but still a lot of email use as well. But I don't know if that's that different from like the big game companies in the States. I've only really done like indie dev and small companies, so we were always very like casual about pretty much everything at
Do
the
you
small
think
places.
these daily email reports, like, are actually read and, they're really going over with a fine-tooth comb, or is it just kind of a cultural thing, like everyone must submit them?
I think they are read because I do get like comments from like things that I mentioned in my email. Although I think usually it's usually pretty basic to be honest for like what you did because a lot of times it'll be like yeah today's work like concerning like this part of the game we're developing. I continued doing what I did yesterday and then I did this or maybe I found a bug or something like that. And there's sort of ways that they you can like put things in brackets and like bold and like there's sort of like a hierarchy they've sort of designed, which is probably different per company, but the one that Grezzo uses is like fairly easy to like highlight when you need to talk about something important. Um, I guess I don't know if like every single one of them is read and by how many people, but
Huh.
probably not crazy amount. But yeah, it does seem like if you're like a manager person and you had to read all the daily reports from everyone in your team, that would be a lot of time, which It could also just be that they spend a lot of time. I guess one thing that I haven't directly experienced that much myself, but a lot of the senior staff at Grezzo do have to work fairly long hours fairly often. And that's kind of is what a lot of people expect from like Japanese companies in general. And it's kind of true. Like there's a lot of not crazy overwork, but just people staying late fairly often. And in my case, in Grezzo's case, it's usually like the more senior staff, which is I don't know if that's normal or not, but it's kind of interesting to me. 'Cause my impression was that maybe they would do that more for like the newer staff to sort of like prove that they're super loyal or something. But in Grezzo's case, they basically try to make all the younger people go home if they stay any kind of late. Like I work late every once in a while, and usually when I do, they're like, "Yeah, go home."
Well,
That's their
yeah,
thing.
that's my kind of, sort of rudimentary knowledge of Japanese companies kinda comes from my wife who
Mhm,
works for, one of the larger ones in Tokyo, and, although she's obviously based here in the States, but, her managers are Japanese, and her work hours are crazy. Like,
mhm,
she's working 14, 15, 16 hours a day,
yeah,
um, but, when she's over there, same deal. But,
mhm,
it's kind of funny. There's a reason why I asked you the question about, like, workplace culture shock is I've talked to a number of people over my life who have worked there, and I get these, like, 2 accounts. So,
mhm,
it's just like some people say, the Japanese are so rigid and overly bureaucratic, overly hierarchical, and as foreigners, that people feel like, oh, they have to do like sometimes double the work of their colleagues to get ahead, work the long hours. And I've met people like you seem to enjoy it. And my wife definitely enjoys it. And she says that she loves working for a Japanese company because even though the hours are long, she feels respected by, her coworkers or boss. And it's just a great place to be in comparison to Western companies, perhaps because there's that stability that you were mentioning that, you're not gonna get
mhm,
laid off, when the next financial quarter. So,
yeah.
I mean, did you ever feel like that pressure of, "Hey, I've really gotta prove myself above and beyond what my Japanese coworkers have to do," or is it, just you're one of the team and you don't have to think about it?
I mostly feel like I'm one of the team, and I think actually they, in some cases, they kind of give me more slack because I'm a foreigner. It probably depends a lot on the company, and I think it also depends on like I've heard that like Asian foreigners in Japan sometimes have it really hard because they're basically have the same expectations of Japanese people. Overall, I've heard that colloquially. That's probably not true in every case, but I've heard it can be harder because yeah, because they think they're closer to Japanese to sort of have the same expectations. I'm like very visibly for an American guy, so they probably don't have the quite same expectations for me. But I really want to say that for Grezzo, particularly someone who has not actually worked at like any famous companies before Grezzo, they have been very kind and like uh, both on like the Japanese side and just like the game development side too. Like I've been learning quite a bit, and even though people are really busy, I do feel like they do take the time to try to explain things to me and show me how to do things and sort of like help me sort of fit in with the team as well. I've had a little bit of like feelings of like being kind of separate from the team sometimes too though because I wasn't working on Echoes of Wisdom and most of the people were. There were some cases where it felt like everyone was really busy on this project that I didn't really know what was going on exactly. And my initial contract actually was only to work on Jet Dragon. My current contract is actually open to work on whatever, so I think I might be starting a new project relatively soon. Um, but yeah, that felt a little bit not necessarily isolating, but it did feel a little bit strange to be like in this really busy place, but you're not actually working on the thing that's making everyone really busy. Um, but yeah, everyone at Grezzo has been really nice to me so far, and yeah, I feel really glad to be there. And I don't feel like there's over like hierarchy things going on. I feel like everybody is basically treated as like the same, which I think also I said before that like we don't really use the really super formal Japanese like keigo at Grezzo. It's mostly just everybody on the same level. And a lot of my coworkers that sit near me are actually really nice, and we just talk about random stuff. And there's one of the new graduate hires. also knows a lot about like indie games. So like I see him at game conventions and stuff, so sometimes we hang out. So overall, it's a very good environment, I think. And even though it is, yeah, it is busy and long hours sometimes. And probably if I become like a full time, like forever employee, what they call seishain in Japanese, I might be doing like more overwork or not like long hours, I guess, maybe a better word. But it seems like it's a good team and people sort of try to have fun with it. And obviously, I think we make really good stuff too. So in that way, it kind of feels like even though I'm working hard, at least I'm making a really cool thing that hopefully lots of people will care about. So that I think that helps with the motivation part of it as well.
So you mentioned this a couple times. This you said Keigo, this super formal Japanese. Like, just briefly tell us like what that is. Is it just a like a totally different type of language that you have to learn, or is it just what's the barrier of entry? If let's say you have basic Japanese, you're proficient. How long does it take to learn that?
Yeah, I think it can take a while. The thing with Keigo is it's not necessarily like that much more complicated than like regular polite Japanese, but they do use just different words. It's like the main thing. And basically there's like humble form and honorific form, and you're supposed to use honorific form to talk about the actions that people are like above you in the hierarchy do, and the humble form to talk about stuff that you do. And other nuances in that too, like if we're talking about like something that uh another company does and your company does. So there's a lot of sort of like social hierarchy things you have to think about to know which one you're supposed to use in which situation. Which I think that plus just having to learn new words that basically mean the same thing. Like kaberu is a word for eat, but meshi ageru is like the keigo way to say that. Um, and because you don't use it very much in your daily life, it's just kind of like, oh, I already know how to say this in regular Japanese, but now I have to think about one, like what my relationship is with and who I'm talking about, and then two, if there is another word, I have to use the other word. And because often there's two different words, it just gets confusing. Honestly, if you do it a lot, probably it's not that hard and becomes second nature. And I do know a little bit of Keigo, so I'm not like complete idiot either, but um, I think considering that just speaking would just knowing like casual form Japanese and polite form Japanese, and then having to add like kind of two different levels onto that, it's just kind of a lot. And because you have to think about all these other things in the background, it's a little bit more difficult to get out unless you probably if you do it very often, it's very second nature. But for me, I think it's partially just because I don't practice it that much, and it also seems generally not that useful because yeah, I don't know. It's only used in specific situations, and at my company, we also don't use it very much. So I might never get good at Keiko. I guess it may be the thing I'm trying to say.
Well, I mean, it's sad to see. I never knew that. That is fascinating. I knew about like the honorifics and the politeness, but I didn't realize there was these, like you said, two levels above that. You know, on our Discord, sometimes you post some pictures of events that you go to and things that you encounter. As a developer over there, what was kind of the coolest experience that you've had in the scene, so to speak, over there?
I will
As
say
far
that.
as
Mm, those.
go ahead.
Sorry. Oh, I would say that like definitely the first time coming over here and showcasing my game at that convention in Kyoto that's called Bit Summit was a very like cool moment of my life, and I think that's probably the main reason why I ended up like seriously considering moving here. Um, Part of the cool things that happened there was because there was like a publisher that was courting us, and they kind of were one of the people that like was running the convention, so they had a little bit of power in that situation. So for example, one of the things that happened at that convention was the game I made, the Super Slime Arena, was like a multiplayer game, and we had a whole bunch of like famous game developers come up on stage and play it with me, which was really cool. Like there was like Igarashi, the Castlevania guy, and Swery, um, and a bunch like a couple guys from like Famitsu, and yeah, just a bunch of like interesting games like Takfuji also. If you remember the guy who did like the Dream speech from what was that E3 like 2009 or something. Anyway, that's an
Wow.
interesting fellow as well. But yeah, but like a bunch of like relatively. Oh yeah, Suda 51 was there too, so I got to play like my silly little indie game up on stage with like these famous game developers, and there's like a professional fighting game player too from Chile called Kane Blue River, who's like a really cool guy. So I got to meet him too, and it was funny because one of the gimmicks of the game I made is that you can use basically any type of game controller to play it. It's supposed to be like a really simple, accessible game, and part of it's like, even if you have a custom made controller because you have a disability, you can use it. But we also will bring just a bunch of like wacky controllers with us to conventions. So like we have a bunch of like just like regular retro ones like Super Nintendo and 64. We also have really strange things like we have like the Dreamcast fishing rod controller,
Huh.
and the professional fighting game guy was actually doing very well and beat all of us using the DK bongos. So this is a bizarre scene up at Bit Summit, on stage. It's not a huge convention. It's pretty big. It's like the biggest indie game convention in Japan. So that was definitely a really cool experience. And then like that plus, yeah, like doing a bunch of traveling and meeting a bunch of people was really cool. Recently, I think I shared in the Discord that I also went to this Mother 2 event, which was also really interesting. I think it's the 30th anniversary of Mother 2, and they had like several exhibitions, but there was like a main one and a couple like side ones. But the highlights were definitely they had a whole bunch of the development materials, including because I like pixel art. They had a bunch of these old like basically like graph paper sprite sheets that showed like all the different like characters and enemies, and they also had a bunch of the like actual clay models that were used in a bunch of the like promotional material for it. And I think it was just used as like concept art for the game. And then yeah, a bunch of things and a lot of like scripts and like even some sheet music and stuff too. They had that was just behind glass on the wall. You could see like the actual development documents from Mother Two. That was like extremely cool. So I think one thing that's also great about being in Japan and maybe being in Tokyo in particular is that there's just all sorts of events that are happening all the time. Honestly, it's a little overwhelming sometimes because I do try to go to a lot of them, and I still go to a lot of indie game developer events too. So it's really it's always exciting and maybe a little bit tiring, but it's definitely inspiring as well, and it sort of makes me want to you know keep getting better at making games and keep meeting interesting people. And seems like I don't know, it's just a great place for that. You get a lot of like interesting foreign developers that come to Japan on vacation or end up moving here too. I know a couple people that have moved over since I have, so it seems like it's a really cool and growing community as well for indie game developers and people that work at game companies as well. So cool place. Yeah.
Yeah, well, see, that was the inspiration for the question is because when I saw you post those pictures of, the Earthbound event or Mother 2 event, I was like,
Mm,
"Man, that's incredible," just to see that, and I know you do a lot of the conventions, so, yeah, it seems like, Tokyo is, the place to be, obviously, in the industry, so,
mm,
just fascinating that you're able to have those experiences. One last question about work,
mm.
it sounds to me like that indie game, was your ticket as much as anything else. Do you find that developing a good indie game is essentially kind of resume that people should consider if they're looking to get into the industry?
Definitely helps a lot, I would say. And I will say also, like the game I made, Super Slime Arena, wasn't like crazy successful. I think it mostly was honestly useful because it allowed us to go to a bunch of different conventions and meet a bunch of people. So I also got like we were there used to be I think this it's kind of had a revival but kind of hasn't. There's a group that was called the Indie Mega Booth that would basically purchase a big section of a lot of the conventions, mostly in America, and then sort of divvied up with a bunch of little indie games. So we showed at the Indie Mega Booth several times, I think 3 times total, and we went to like PAX East and PAX West, and we also went to GDC one time with Indie Mega Booth, and they also were ones that helped us get into Bit Summit. So I think definitely, yeah. Obviously, it helps if you have any kind of indie game that people are at least a little bit interested in. If you can show up places and get meet people, that generally will help a lot. I noticed that even for people that are doing like the Senmongako, sort of the trade school thing I mentioned before in Japan, usually you have like a capstone project, and a lot of those projects will be shown at smaller conventions here in Japan. And I think, yeah, particularly for people that are like quite young and like just graduating, that's usually a big part of their resume slash portfolio for applying to someplace like Grezzo. And I know for Grezzo, a lot of our new hires are from like specifically like a game development, like trade school, basically. So I think there's definitely a lot of uh, benefits to doing that. And yeah, obviously, if you make a really good, super successful indie game, you can just keep doing that and have lots of money, which would be nice. But if you make an okay indie game, that at least can bring you to some conventions, that can definitely help. And honestly, I think not just in Japan, but in general, game companies don't care so much about your like formal like educational qualifications. They care more about like your actual skills, and the best way to show that is by showing something you've made. So definitely, if you want to work for a game company, the more decent game demos you can show them, I think the better. Um, so yeah, I definitely recommend that as a way to get into the industry if you're interested. But I will also say that it's I think even more so when I was doing it, there's a crazy amount of competition. Um, Especially in indie games field, like if you want to do it as like a business, it's very fraught with danger and risk. Uh, and in my case, we didn't really make that much money off the game either, but it did open other doors, and it was a good experience. I'm very glad I did it, but I also don't want to like say that, oh yeah, like just make an indie game and you'll make a bit of money and then you'll totally get hired by some game company. Like it still is a lot of work and I think a lot of luck too. Like I think in my case with randomly meeting that art director from Grezzo, uh kind of turned out to be probably a very influential part of me getting a job there. And it was kind of just random. So um but definitely like putting yourself out there and yeah, generally trying to make, connections with people is definitely going to help you a lot, just in general, I think. And not just even for the helping part, you'll just meet interesting people that will inspire you. And, you know, sometimes even, yeah, just like applying to events too. Like one reason why that Super Slime Arena game sort of became big enough to turn into something you could show is because we kept finding like little events we could bring it to, and then we were like, oh, what can we get done like before this event? And that sort of inspired us and kept us sort of chugging along with the development as well. So I think anything that can inspire you to sort of finish games and finish demos and stuff too is also really good. Sorry for
Well,
no rambling now, but yeah.
no, I mean, I think it's great career advice. Like, I am not somebody that is in any kind of computer science field or game development field, so to me, just as kind of a layperson, I assume that, oh, well, you have to get a degree in computer science or game design, and there was a very formalized process. But I think, what you're saying kind of makes sense. Show people what you can do, and even if you don't succeed on Steam and it's like you said, a lot of competition. It's a kind of resume. It's a networking vehicle, and
Mhm.
I think that can be useful to people. I want to turn also just to like life over there. On our Discord, we're collectors and retro gamers, and we're a little bit obsessive. So I think, of course, Jay and I talk about this all the time, importing and stuff like that. But game hunting in Tokyo, like what, do you do it? And maybe without mentioning sort of specific stores, because, we don't want you to reveal your sources, but just what would you tell somebody who's going over there as a game hunting tourist? What should they look for?
I gotcha. Well, I will say that Tokyo is probably not the best place to do it, which I think is kind of common knowledge now. But there's definitely still good things here, but usually the prices are quite high. So if you want like cheap stuff, definitely like get as far away from Tokyo as you can. The place I live is I still live in Tokyo, but I'm very close to Chiba Prefecture, which is in like east of Tokyo. And
Okay.
so when I go retro game hunting, usually I go out into Chiba. um, there's a lot of like, I mean, people know about Hard Off as like a pretty big like chain store of used things in general, but they do have a lot of games. So I get stuff from that. Also, like Yahoo Auctions is pretty good. It's basically like Japanese eBay. Sometimes you have to be patient because there's a lot of competition on there too, but you still can get some pretty good deals off of that. Uh, yeah, there's a when I lived in Kyoto, I went game hunting fairly often too, and there was a bunch of like little local places you could go to. But most of those too, yeah, they kind of got better the further away from the main city you went. So yeah, nowadays when I go out, usually to Chiba, I often am going out to some like weird little place. Like I take a train way out into Chiba, and then I take like a bus, and then walk a bit to find some like retro game store or hard off or something. And I don't always find something good, but it's fun. It's honestly one thing I didn't mention before is that like when I moved from Kyoto to Tokyo, I actually ended up selling a whole bunch of my collection. I think I talked a little bit about that in the Discord before, and have kind of mixed feelings about it still, to be honest. Recently I have been doing a bit more like hunting and collecting, but it's still like way down than it was before. But I guess having a really tiny apartment also helps constrain you a little bit. So I guess there's good and bad things about that too. But yeah, definitely recommend going a bit out into the countryside if you can, if you really want to find like good deals on game stuff. If you just want to find good things and you don't mind paying a little bit of money for it, though, there's lots of good places in Tokyo. So definitely, like if you're looking for like a really good souvenir or something you really really want. Like I know a lot of people, my friends that came over, were looking for like Mother 3 or some pristine copy of like Ocarina of Time or something. And you can still get stuff like that. It just, especially if you're in like Akihabara, it's going to cost you. So just be aware of that.
Yeah, Akihabara is just way, way too expensive. I mean, I think as a tourist, especially if you're traveling with someone, like, I couldn't, and didn't wanna, drag my wife into the boondocks to search for games, but I do think, I mean, the Tokyo area is so large, if you just get away from Akihabara and kind of the main places, you
Mhm.
will find some stuff. I mean,
Oh yeah.
I found some great deals, kinda in the area where my wife works, which
Mhm.
is not, near anything that kind of a tourist would go to,
Gotcha.
and, so just and everything's accessible, with the train, so if you can take
Mm.
20, 30 minutes and go game hunting, you can also kind of do all of the other touristy stuff and have non-gaming experiences, which I highly recommend. Don't go over there just to shop.
Oh yeah,
Um
for sure.
it's kind of funny you talked about selling your collection when you moved from Kyoto to Tokyo. Did you have a collection back in the States? And if so, like, what did you do with it when you made this big life transition?
Yeah, so it's actually kind of funny. So I did have a pretty big collection before I moved to Japan, and I actually found out when I was moving that the one of the main shipping companies in Japan is like Yamato Transport, or like Kuroneko is what it's usually called because it has a black cat as its logo. But they actually have like a moving to Japan plan basically, and it was funny because I had, I think, 11 boxes of things, and I think like 7 of those boxes for like all my belongings that I was sending to Japan were games and like
Huh.
consoles. So I lived in Boston and then like the DC area before I moved to Japan. So I didn't have a lot of space in Boston or the DC area either. But I did have a pretty significant portion of like my rooms would be like retro gaming related. Um, which when I did move to Kyoto first, it was a bit overwhelming because yeah, just making it fit in my tiny apartment. I lived in like a company dorm thing before, was quite difficult. Um, but yeah, that basically what happened. Yeah, I got my stuff sent over, and then I did buy some more stuff while I was here, but not like a crazy amount because I still had a pretty big collection. And um, even though I'm sad I sold it, I did kind of sell it maybe in like the best possible way. Like there's a guy I know in Kyoto who is also a game developer for a very very long time. Like he used to make like games that he would distribute on like BBSs and stuff. And I think eventually he sold one of his games to a major game company and made a ton of money off of that. And I think he's used a lot of that money to make a extremely amazing both like a console game and like retro PC game collection. And he uses it also to sort of host events in Kyoto about like once a month. He has like a retro night where he'll bring out some stuff, and usually it's like a based around a theme. So I remember one time when I went, it was like all the different versions he had of like the first Castlevania game. So he had a whole bunch of like these old PC and like obscure versions, and he had a couple ones that were made by like more people like recently too. Like I guess homebrew type stuff. But anyway, I sold the vast majority of my collection to him, where I know it will be cherished and used for good things. And he also gave me a very good rate. And I think part of the other reason why I did it um, was because I think finding a situation where you can find somebody who is willing to pay you like basically market rate for as much as you want to sell is extremely fortunate and rare. So I kind of took advantage of that too, and it really helped me out like for moving here. And I guess a lot of the I had like a lot of like bad stuff happening in the background at the same time, so I needed the money as well, and it really helped me out. I'm glad that my friend was able to do that, and he has that my collection's in like a good place. So that's kind of my feelings on that.
Yeah, that sounds like an absolutely amazing, situation because you're right. I mean, if you ever try to sell some of your collection, people are looking to lowball you, I think, and, to sell it at the market rate is incredible. Um, Last question, and
Mm,
I've wondered this for a while. You know, I feel like in the States, there's, definitely kind of like a retro gaming bubble. You know,
mm,
you're in it, it's popular, I think especially after the pandemic, the prices exploded.
mm.
How would you compare the scene in both countries? I mean, is it a healthy collecting scene in Japan, or is it relatively niche?
I would say that probably overall it's relatively niche, but I also feel like the retro game bubble is like definitely affecting things in Japan as well. Partially because there's like I think it's the most tourists that there have ever been in Japan now. So there's just lots and lots of people here, and a lot of them do want to buy some retro stuff, even if they're not like hardcore collectors. So definitely like just like the prices in Japan are also getting worse, although they're generally still better than the American or European versions of stuff. Um, but I also say that like a lot of the like Japanese friends I know that are also into retro collecting, there's not quite as many of them, and they definitely are not as like I guess like quite as obsessive in like at least not the same ways that like a lot of the Americans and European fans are. I don't know quite how to describe it, but yeah, there's definitely a difference there. I think also just like there's a decent amount of like Japanese retro game collectors that are also interested in like Western stuff. That's kind of like the inverse version of a lot of the retro game collectors in the states, which I guess makes sense, just being interested in foreign things. But I guess another thing that's kind of interesting is the like the Mega Drive was not very popular in Japan, but a lot of the like serious retro collector people I know that are Japanese here are like that's like their thing. They love the Mega Drive, like they collect all the cool Mega Drive games, and they also import Genesis stuff sometimes. So it's kind of interesting because I feel like in the states maybe the inverse is like the Genesis is more common and people like know about it, but they like it. But a lot of people are interested in importing like Super Famicom games. So not sure how much of that is different, but I have noticed at least among my like Japanese friends that are into retro collecting, a lot of them really like the Mega Drive. So
Yeah, I noticed that over there this summer. It seemed like the Mega Drive games were in pristine condition and extremely expensive relative to the other stuff
mm,
on the shelf.
yeah.
Which is interesting. Like the Mega Drive is one console. Now I have a Genesis collection, but sort of importing Mega Drive just never appealed to me because I don't know. I just Sega was always the Genesis anyway was always kind of like position 2 for me back in the day. But yeah, I mean whatever is rare, or wasn't too popular, I think becomes rare and then becomes the object of the collector's desire. But do you find that there's like YouTubers, like Japanese retro gaming YouTubers and influencers and stuff like that, or is that a uniquely American thing?
I'd say there definitely are some in Japan, but there's definitely more in America. And I think like the American perspective on retro games is also sort of influencing, maybe not so much Japan, but definitely influencing Europe and maybe a little bit of Japan as well. But I think the other thing that's interesting about Japan is they have like sort of like official things too. I guess I don't know if you'd say it's official, but they have actual TV shows like Game Center CX obviously is a thing. And I notice even just on like regular variety programs, they will just have stuff that comes out about people being nostalgic about like the Famicom and like other things and just like yeah, retrospectives on games. Um So I kind of feel like maybe in a way, I feel like game appreciation and like retro game appreciation has kind of been sort of a more like background part of like American or a mainstream Japanese culture for a while too. Because I know there's also been like a lot of like anniversary concerts and stuff like video game music has I think been taken a lot more seriously in Japan for longer than it has been in like the West. So it's kind of interesting how different feelings about different consoles and like I guess different parts of retro games are slightly different versus like here versus the states. Yeah, not quite sure my point is in that, but I
No,
have
I mean,
noticed some differences.
I think you're right. I mean, that Game Center CX has been going on for a while, and I don't think that there is an equivalent sort of mainstream cultural appreciation for games. Like, I can't think of any kind of mainstream media outlet in the States that has any kind of or has had any kind of role in retro game appreciation. I mean, maybe you could say the G4 TV network, where they did a
Hmm.
couple of documentaries about I think the Turbo Graphics and the 90s arcade scene, but
Hmm.
even that stuff is 20 years old, and I can't think of anything similar today.
Hmm.
I mean, even if you go, like, through the magazine racks in a Japanese train station, right, they always have some magazine that's celebrating, 30 years of Sega
Hmm.
Saturn, and, uh here we get, if you can find it, the British magazine Retro Gamer
Yeah, yeah.
that maybe, does a little retrospective every quarter, or of course in their main issues, they'll have articles on the ZX Spectrum, stuff like that. Doesn't really resonate with American gamers so much, but that's the only mainstream publication that I could think of. So
Yeah, you're right. I think in general, it's interesting that the magazine like industry as a whole is still maybe not doing like amazing, but definitely doing better in Japan versus maybe anywhere else. Like it's interesting. Like yeah, we obviously still have like Famitsu, but there's like at least like three or four other like weekly or monthly like Nintendo, just Nintendo magazines that exist, and obviously like manga is still really huge in like magazines too. So it's definitely interesting, like kind of being in a place that still has like a physical media like publishing industry doing well.
I'm a fan of those. I think one of them is like Nintendo Dream, I think
Yeah,
is.
yeah. Nintendo Dream is really good. Actually, I think the latest edition has a big like Echoes of Wisdom section in it. So I've actually been meaning to pick up a copy. I'll probably try to get that soon.
Yes, I'm going to be, importing a copy of that. I, uh, I like Nintendo Dream. It just takes me back to getting the old Nintendo Powers
Yeah.
back in the day, so, I also like New Type. Like, I think you're right. I think the Japanese magazine industry still produces engaging magazines, like, even the paper and the art and the ink that they
Mm,
use to print it still holds up, whereas if you get some magazines here, it's like printed on, toilet paper. The colors are washed out. So I am a fan of that, the
yeah.
traditional media market.
Mm.
But yeah, I wanted to. I don't want to hold you for too long. I know it's a work night and it's getting late over there, but we really appreciate that you did this interview. And I would say to people out there, hey, join our Discord. And Oscar is always sharing those experiences from Japan. So thank you very much.
Yeah, my pleasure. I'm very happy to talk and hopefully it was interesting. Hopefully it wasn't too rambly. I don't do a lot of interviews, so but I definitely had a good time talking with you. And yeah, if you ever want me to come back on and just talk about some other subject besides me, that would also be good. I feel a little self conscious tonight.
Hey, we will definitely do that. We want to do it when both of us are available, and
Hmm.
we'll definitely set that up.
Sounds good.